Hello, my name is Max Brandt, and I'm here today with my partner, Kiva.
Hi, I'm Kiva.
And we're going to talk a bit about trans people and how we relate to the internet in regards to safety on the internet. And most of what we're going to start with is just establishing our experience with the internet and why this is an important topic. Personally, I have a lot of experience with the internet. My dad is a computer science professor, and I grew up with pretty open access to the internet. And yeah, I think that came with a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. What about you, Kiva?
Yeah, I had pretty open access to the internet growing up. My dad was very much one of the early adopter types of a new technology comes out, and as soon as he can afford to, he gets it. My mom definitely wasn't that way, but because my dad was, I still had access to a computer with internet access from a young age, and I had my own laptop in middle school. So it simultaneously provided a lot of opportunities for social interaction that I otherwise wouldn't have had, and some degree of escapism, but I definitely would not say it was all good.
Yeah. So for me, one of the big things that I have seen for myself and for others as a positive benefit of being trans and having the internet is that early on in transition, it's easier for us to portray ourselves in a way that aligns with how we feel on the inside, when that might not be quite as possible externally for a while. And so it can be a really good source of identity exploration. What about you? What's a positive you can think of?
Yeah, I'd say that ability to explore identity more, especially my perception of my own gender has changed quite a bit over the years, and at each kind of stage of that, interacting with people online or interacting with people I know through online means has been a big portion of that. One of the kind of most prominent examples for me was as I started identifying more as masculine, but in a trans way. The character that I made on Final Fantasy XIV provided a big outlet for me to explore that, to see if it's more just a part of me or an aspect of being gender fluid, or if it was really more broadly throughout my whole life. And that is something I don't think I would have had otherwise, because despite having a lot of supportive people in my life now, I didn't have as many supportive people in person at the time. And also, it's scarier when you're faced with the person to be like, hey, this is who I think I might be.
Yeah.
Can we try stuff out? There's more immediate consequences to that when you're in person than online.
Yeah. I think for me, my experience of coming out was a lot more intense and in person, so I totally get that why it would be a lot easier to do that with a bit of distance. There are also a lot of negative experiences that are unique to us as trans people, but also a lot of them are things that mirror things that other minority groups are experiencing on the internet. I myself have gotten death threats and all sorts of anonymous hate and sometimes not anonymous hate.
Yeah.
Do you have any experiences you want to share that are the negative side of that?
Yeah. I don't remember exactly how I came to this sort of number, but by the time I was 21, I probably had received 100 different death threats online related to me being trans or being queer and not hiding being trans, even if that wasn't the focus of it. And people are a lot more graphic about it online than they are in person a lot of the time. I've had maybe one graphic death threat to my face, but the one time I had someone threaten me in person for being trans, it was very a vague, like, yeah, like, we're gonna kill you kind of thing. But online, people, because there's not the, like, immediate visual impact of what you're saying, they will go into a lot of detail, and it's really upsetting no matter how jaded you are.
Yeah, I think so. For myself, one of the things I've always found really interesting in my life is my ability to connect with people who are self-identifying as transphobic and as people who are actively against trans people, and usually I'm able to get them to, at the very least, decide that I'm one of the good ones, which is not the best thing in the world, but it is interesting. And I think in part it's because those interactions were happening in person.
Yeah.
I think that the smoke screen of being behind a screen gives people, it makes it easier to dehumanize us.
Yeah, and I don't have any of it on hand, but a lot of research bears this out of the level of anonymity that you have when you're interacting online means that you're more likely to interact in more extreme ways.
Yeah.
And even just not including death threats, like more general calls for violence or like espousing the worst possible legislation that could exist regarding trans people, and even like flaunting it in people's faces of this is the terrible thing that I think should happen to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other thing I've noticed that I want to make sure that we bring up is that the rampant fetishization and how people will literally just come out of the woodwork and be like, hey, here's a really weird comment about your genitalia. Have a nice day.
Yeah, it's definitely made existing in spaces that are dedicated more for sexuality online to be difficult.
Because it's not impossible. It does make it so that it's just...
Because it, like, those spaces already have an issue with objectification and, like, just no sense of boundaries. Again, because there's a screen in the way, you don't see the impact of what you're saying. But there's... It just is amplified because not only do those comments happen, but they're often about the parts of you that cause you distress. Right. And it's, hey, I'm going to reduce you to the thing that you wish was not the case.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make really weird sexual comments about it. And if you're not into, that's a you problem.
Yeah. It's also just, like, unsettling to be going about your business, not doing anything that you think will incur those kinds of comments, and to get those kinds of comments, it's very weird.
Well, I don't use Facebook anymore for many reasons, transphobia kind of being a big one, but the history of message requests in Facebook Messenger that I have, for a while it was like alternating death threats and like people just making really weird, out of nowhere sexual comments about me.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting.
Yeah. And, like, I think that in some ways it both mirrors the experience of a lot of some women online, and it's also amped up by 10 times because the people who are coming out of the woodwork don't see you as a person. They see you as a sexual object, which is so, like, weird and dehumanizing.
Yeah, and that's definitely true a lot of the time for women as a whole, but there's kind of, it does go a step further because there's this, this is a group that already doesn't have a lot of rights and acceptance, so, like, any amount of positive attention, positive, in quotes, attention, they should be grateful for it, that I'm not, like, giving them a death threat instead.
And there's also, like, look at me, I'm being such a good person by sending weird sexual comments to a trans person. No, that's not how that works.
Or, you're trans, you must obviously want me to send a dick pic.
Yeah, that's okay.
Not what I was going for.
Yeah. Yeah, I really wish you hadn't.
One thing I will say, too, about the internet is just by the way that social media in particular works and the nature of online arguments, it's unfortunately really easy to self-harm under the guise of standing up for yourself. That's something that I struggle with a lot, is you might go into a comment section of something where there's a lot of transphobia, and you might genuinely want to, like, either start a dialogue or educate or even just, like, argue for the sake of convincing a hypothetical third person.
I think it's also, yes, and I think that's a trap that unfortunately is way easier for, like, people who have just come out and are still very emotionally raw about it to fall into, and that makes it even more dangerous, I think.
Yeah, and it also lends itself really well to the, like, mental and, like, cognitive traps that are set for a lot of trans people when they first come out, of bioessentialism.
Yeah.
I unfortunately fell into that for quite a bit when I first came out because I was so desperate to prove that I was who I said I was that I remember, like, going back and forth for days on end in comment sections about the research on brain structure and brain chemistry when, like, a lot of that does show differences, but there's so much overlap that it's not really useful when talking about individual people. But I would cite all of these things as if they were, like, the absolute truth because I had to have something to show that I was who I said I was.
Yeah, and I think that really boils down to the crux of why it's so difficult not to argue, because especially at the beginning, you are saying who you are, and unfortunately, a lot of people are going to just outright disagree. And it's one of the weirdest things. That's not really something that happens with other identities, or not a lot of other identities, where you can be like, this is who I am, and someone else can be like, ha, no, you're not, I disagree. And it's, whoa, what a weird and personal attack that feels like.
Yeah.
Because you're, like, bearing this part of you that is still pretty vulnerable, and then someone's, no.
It is just shutting you down in a way that is pretty, for the most part, pretty unique to the trans experience, of just not even saying that you're less than or saying that you're bad, but just outright saying that you don't exist to your face, I guess through a screen, but, like, directly to you. And the internet makes that so much more likely to happen because you're exposed to so many more people, and it's harder to curate who you're around and who you're exposed to.
Yeah. And I will say, I think the audience of this podcast is mostly not going to be trans people, but for the portion of it that is, I think it's really important to mention that a lot of this gets easier to deal with.
Yeah.
Once you become more secure in your own identity and you have people who are supportive around you in real life, and you're able to start to reconcile who you are on the inside with how you are on the outside, I think that it gets exponentially easier. And I would say that for me, it's gotten to the point where it does still bother me, but not nearly as much as it did when
Yeah.
I was younger.
Yeah. I I definitely still have days where it really wears me down, but I'm not like driven to being an emotional wreck for a little while because of how vulnerable I was being exposed to this.
And I think also it takes getting to the point where you can say, okay, there are some people who are just going to hate me.
Yeah.
There are just going to be some people who are going to hate me. They don't even have to have a reason. And that's okay. And I'm allowed to let them hate me.
Yeah. And also, it takes time to find and build and integrate into communities.
Yes.
And that's still true online. And first coming out, like, you might go to the sort of broader, like, online groups that are, yeah, have more people and are more anonymized that way, but also have less personal connection because of that. And that's not really the same level of support as 5 years, 10 years down the line of having smaller groups, whether it's specific aspects of your identity or
Online
kind of
communities.
intersections,
Ones where it's actually a community.
a community as opposed to like just a forum.
Yeah.
That makes it a lot easier because you now have a place that you can retreat to, and also you've already done all of the work of curating your experience to whatever extent is possible nowadays,
For sure.
where you're not exposed to as much negativity and you are exposed to people who are going to accept you more.
Yeah, I think that's really good to mention. So I think that's all I really wanted to address. Next up, you'll hear a conversation between me and my dad about internet safety, and I hope you enjoy. So now I'm going to speak with my dad. He is Dr. Scott Brandt. He has a PhD in computer science, and he is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of California in Santa Cruz. He specializes in computer systems, including distributed systems, and to a lesser degree, computer system security. And he has worked in computer security developing secure operations systems for the NSA, and has worked with the US National Labs and has held several different security clearances and is trained in security, which is part of why I'm going to be talking with him today about internet safety as it relates to trans people and just minorities in general. Go ahead and say hi, Dad.
Hi, everybody.
So, could you go ahead and tell me a little bit about some recommendations you would have for internet safety?
Sure. This is because I have children who were once children and are now just citizens of the world. I've thought quite a bit about this topic, and there's some things to be aware of. And a lot of what I'm going to say is pretty generic and applies to everybody. But as we can discuss it toward the end, I think it especially applies to trans people and minorities of all kinds.
For sure, for sure.
Well, the first thing is the internet's an incredible information resource. It has transformed the world and it's going to continue to transform the world. And we have information at our fingertips that dwarfs anything that we had in the pre-internet age. So it's incredibly positive and incredibly valuable. But at the same time, I really think of the internet as the Wild West because, in some sense, everybody's anonymous and it's really almost impossible to police effectively. And the people who are trying to do bad things to other people take advantage of that. They know it and take advantage. So that's my high level thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's very poignant. Do you have any more specific recommendations?
Oh yeah, plenty. First, you have to consider who you're talking to when you put things out on the internet. And there's a few aspects to that. First of all, if you post something on the web, you're telling that to everybody in the world potentially. And that information, once it's out there, is almost impossible to reel back in.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Internet Archive exists and it collects snapshots of every web page on the internet periodically. And
I will say I do wish I had listened better when I was a kid. When you told me about that the internet is forever, because now I'm very highly aware of what's out on the internet about me specifically and what information is available to people. And I have a lot of reasons to maybe not want everyone to have all that information about me.
yeah, there are mechanisms that you can try to take advantage of. It could be copied a million. Everything could be copied a million times. So maybe you could ask the archive to remove something, but you can't find every copy of it.
Right.
The other thing is, you also just never know who you're talking to specifically. Even when you're talking to an individual, everybody's anonymous, and it makes it really that has a bunch of different sort of effects. But one of them is it's easy to be open with anonymous people, strangely, because they're distant. But also, there's no way to know if somebody is who they claim to be. In real life, there are a lot of filters that prevent just random people from talking to us as getting into our inner circle. And on the internet, all of those filters are gone. If you meet a friend of a friend, if they're your friend's friend, they probably know them and you can ask about them and learn about them. But when you encounter people online, they could be anybody. And so the sort of things that usually protect us from I don't know, unsafe people just don't exist the same way on the internet.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And it makes me think too about there are scammers from whole other countries that are talking to people online trying to scam them. And like they could be, I don't know, in a different country and you wouldn't even know sometimes because they've gotten good at faking what they're faking. And I think in the real world that just isn't even a possibility. So it's a very unique issue to the internet.
Exactly. And those people spend a lot of time refining their scams, way more time than we spend figuring out how to avoid them. And so
Exactly.
it's just really important to keep those things in mind. And I actually tend to trust people, but there's so many things about in-person interaction that tell you about who you're talking to and whether you can trust them. And psychologists, there's been studies, and what they say is that about 90% of communication is nonverbal. And that means only about 10% is the words people are saying and how they're saying them. And everything else that we would normally use to assess who we're talking to and the veracity of what they're saying and their intentions and all of that is gone when we're communicating with people on the internet. And if it's written communication, you don't even have tone of voice. There's things like somebody's tone of voice, their body language, their facial expressions, maybe how they're dressed. There's all kinds of things that we interpret. Their eyes and where their eyes are looking while they're talking. All of that stuff contributes to us assessing what people are saying and interpreting what they're saying. And when you're talking to people online, you have none of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. From an anecdotal point of view, even just myself, back when I was not being as safe on the internet as I should have been, like I definitely met people in person who I had not gotten any of the bad vibes from online interactions who pretty quickly I got really bad vibes from with in-person interactions. So it's really interesting to
Yeah,
hear that.
yeah, that statistic is striking. But there's people who devote their careers to researching this kind of stuff,
Oh yeah.
and I believe it. Um, And this applies to everything. It's not just the individuals, but about information you find online as well. You have to treat it with some skepticism because along with all the good information, there's a whole lot of bad information and misinformation. And you can't tell people's intentions online, which is why you have to look to reputable sources.
That's a good point, and with that as well, it makes me think about how, like, back when you'd have to go to a library to research things, there are hoops that people would have to jump through to get something published, and that just doesn't apply to internet publication.
Yeah,
Uh,
so yeah, you would go to the library, the publishers would filter the stuff, or you read things in the news, and the news people took their jobs seriously and guarded their reputations really carefully because they knew that they had to be the trusted source of information when it was hard to get information out there. And now anybody can publish something online. And all of those filters, it's cheap to do, it's easy to do, and there's nobody policing it. So the stuff's just out there. And honest people put stuff out there, but dishonest people, now it's very easy for them to put out information and blanket us with it.
it's really easy to the misinformation online is just rampant, and it's really unfortunate because there are a lot of people who, like, I see online, especially older people, who are intaking that information and not being quite as critical of where they're getting it from. Uh,
Yep, because
eh
they're used to trusting the sources. Yep.
exactly. And also just younger people who haven't been taught critical thinking skills falling into these traps that are being set online.
In terms of advice, one of the pieces of advice I would give people is trust your gut when it tells you something is wrong. Those little red flags that you see, don't ignore them. If it doesn't seem 100%, it's probably 100% wrong. So if something doesn't seem right online, it probably isn't. I want to share a story because one of the things, you specifically asked me about trans people and minorities more broadly online. And I think that the scammers are out there trying to scam everybody. But in particular, trans people, LGBT people in general, and minorities, there are people out there that will target you specifically
Yeah.
and seek to do you harm. And they're spending a lot of energy figuring out how to do it. And it's important to be aware of how much work people are willing to put into their crazy bad schemes and just to be a bit cagey about it in general. And I want to share a story about security more broadly to illustrate this point, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I think I told you a little bit about this before, but I worked with Los Alamos National Lab, which is one of the US national labs where, among other things, they develop nuclear weapons. And they have extremely tight security. And I had a clearance so that I could work with them. I don't work on weapons, but the work I was doing did intersect with some of the stuff they were doing there. And I had to go do some security training at Los Alamos National Lab before I could get the clearance. And they had a video. So I had this day of training, and then they had a video, and the video that we watched at the end of the day featured Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the former head of the Russian KGB, which is their national spy agency. And the video was, I don't know, 45 minutes long. And it was mind blowing, first of all, that they got the former head of the KGB to do this video for them. Right. He was just standing outside Los Alamos by the sign at the front gate and talking. And one of the things he said was that before he was the head of the KGB, one of his assignments was Los Alamos National Lab. That was his job to find out everything he could about the lab. And he said, I want you to understand that we were very serious about this. And if you're working at the lab, even if you're just going there once in a while, we know who you are. We know who your family is. We know what your favorite foods are. We know
Whoa.
where you work and what you do after work and what your hobbies are and who you interact with and what sports your children do and what your wife does while you're away at work or your spouse. He said, we know everything about Every single one of you, we know what time you go to work. We know when you come home from work. If you go to a bar, we know what bar you like to go to. We know if you have to drink. We know everything about you. And if you think we don't, and if you think we're not targeting you, you're wrong. Every single person that works there is a possible avenue for us to get inside and get information. And if there's some way that we can compromise you or blackmail you or trick you, we've thought about how to do it.
Wow.
Totally mind blowing. And I believed every word he said. I totally believed that was what they did. Oh, there was another piece of it was if you ever leave the US and you're in another country and suddenly a pretty woman or man approaches you, they're probably one of ours.
Wow.
We target people from the labs and people with high security clearances when they're overseas.
That is a really wild statement, and it's saying a lot. That's wild.
Yeah, and the thing that's so breathtaking about it is that they clearly have invested a whole lot of energy into figuring out how to get to people. And the average person, who is the average sane person, doesn't spend that much time thinking about how people are trying to get them. And so we're at a disadvantage. And I think the same thing is true online. There's lots of haters and predators and scammers, and you can't tell who's who online.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
So yeah, you just have to be careful and assume. Unfortunately, it's really unfortunate. I like to live my life trusting people until they show me that I can't trust them. But especially when you're online, you have to always have your barriers up. Um,
Yeah. And one piece that I've talked about a bit in my other bits of my writing for this internet and culture course is that one of the things that made me reassess my presence on the internet and what I was putting on the internet is when I got a stalker and was genuinely pretty afraid of her finding out information about me that could lead to her showing up in person. And at that point, I pretty much stopped using all social media as like postings. I've stopped posting anything about myself, and I'm very cagey about who I talk to on the internet now because this is a person who clearly is putting in way more effort to try to get to me than I am thinking about her. Like, it's a really good example of that where it's frankly, I would like to not be thinking about her at all, but the amount that she's clearly thinking about me is making it so that's not always the safest choice.
yeah, exactly.
Do you have any other thoughts before we conclude here?
We could probably talk for 3 hours, but those were the main things I wanted to share with you today.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you for your time, and thank you all for your time as well, the listeners. Thank you.